NRG are a North American organization, and previously in their CSGO lineup, they did field a majority of North American players, but with the European players Gobbi and Lagija, former Mouse Sports players, in the lineup. Now, they're a team that still is a North American org. They play in EPL North America, but now that the team has 3 Europeans in their ranks, because they've got Tabson in, the guy who actually stood in for them at Counterpit famously when they beat Envious. Now they're only North Americans, they've only got 2. And so with the qualification system that's in place for the next major, the E-League major, we know that you go through the minor, and then if you place top 2 at the minor, you get to go to the offline qualifier, and then if you get through the offline qualifier, obviously you get to go to the major if you're one of the top 8 teams at the qualifier. But the minor system is regional. It's not just an open system, it's depending on what region you're from. And so if NRG used their main lineup with 3 Europeans, they would not be eligible to compete in the Americas minor, the one that's for North America, South America. Instead, they should be competing in the European minor. So you might think that is what would happen. Indeed, I thought that as well. That's why I'd heard initially was possibility because of the fact that they had these 3 Europeans. But no, apparently NRG will try to compete in the Americas minor, but using a stand-in instead of one of their European players. Apparently, it's going to be Gobbi who comes out of the lineup. I mean, obviously, their weakest player, weakest fragger. And in comes a North American player, so that they have 3 North Americans and they can play in the Americas minor. Then, presumably, now this hasn't been explicitly said, but it's fairly obvious. I mean, it's as far as I can tell, this is the obvious scenario of why they're doing this. Then if they were to qualify from the Americas minor by finishing top 2, they would then go to the offline qualifier for the major, which is, remember, it's open. It's all the regions combined into one for the offline qualifier. And at that point, nationality is irrelevant. You can be from any region. And so they would reinsert Gobbi and they would have their full strength real lineup back together for the offline qualifier. Now, that premise is bullshit. That should not be allowed to exist. And that absolutely bends and twists out of shape a rule that was clearly not intended for that sort of a scenario. I mean, this is a blatant attempt to exploit and abuse what is a loophole for NRG, essentially. It's not a loophole for other teams. It's a rule that exists to help and benefit teams from the Americas so that they are not overrun by teams from other countries who just want to come to their qualifier. So here's the thing. I get why NRG are doing it, especially because NRG is not a very strong team. It's not like they're a top 2, top 3 team in the Americas anyway, and they know for certain that they're going to win the Americas minor, like it seems like someone like Immortals will when they go. But rather, NRG is a team which, even in the Americas minor, even with their full strength lineup, might not be able to come top 2 there. So they definitely would not get through the European minor, and they would have a very, very hard time there indeed. So I understand why, to boost their chances, they're willing to take this risk that admittedly not many teams would take, and therefore the loophole wouldn't be abused like this in most scenarios and wouldn't really even be a problem that we'd think of could exist. So, and by the way, as I mentioned, it's still not even that likely that NRG makes it with a stand-in at the Americas minor anyway. So it's not going to have a massive consequence, presumably, but the fact that this exists is a loophole which, now that they've shown us it exists, needs to be closed. Because this rule is there to protect the qualification slots for the offline qualifier, the open one, for the different regions, so that we actually get 2 teams from the Asia area. I mean, Australasia obviously counted in there. We actually get 2 teams from the Americas. We actually get 2 teams from the European one. This is what's supposed to be happening. You're not supposed to be in a world where, I mean, it must be more, it must be 4 from the European one, right? 2 from the CIS one. You're not supposed to be able to just sneak over to someone else's qualifier and qualify in an easier fashion. Otherwise, that would happen all the time. Like, people would just fuck around. Like, someone would go over to the CIS qualifier and just, go, as in if there was no rule for nationality, go to the CIS qualifier, qualify from that. It'd be much easier than the European one. Some from North America might go to the Asian one if they were like the 4th best North American team, and there's going to be a couple others that maybe they'll go over there. So that's what it's designed to stop that and make you compete in your minor and go through the system properly, and then you get to the offline qualifier if you're good enough. Now, the big problem that I have in this scenario is actually not even just the notion that they're going to bring in this guy and compete in the minor. That's fine. If they really want to just compete in North America's minor, fine. Bring in a guy who's North American and go through the minor and continue on. Now, my problem is that you then are going to bring Gobbi back in. That's when the loophole comes, that if you were to qualify, you're basically going to then just have get to the offline qualifier and transform into a European team again, even though you only got to the qualifier, most likely, because you were playing in the Americas minor. There's the issue. There's the loophole that they're trying to exploit. So the rules exist to protect the qualification slots by region. Now, obviously, the hypothetical scenarios I suggested of a European team doing it or a team from North America doing it, as in going to another region's qualifier, even using this loophole, it's pretty low, right? It's almost not going to happen. I mean, the only one I can actually think of is the CIS qualifier, where in theory there are people who might be like okay teams who have 1 or 2 CIS players in it who are mainly European, who might be better off just taking a pretty good CIS stand-in and just going to the CIS qualifier. It would give them a better chance. But even then, it's not likely they'll make it out. It's not likely it'll happen in general. So I also think a big issue I want to point out here is this is one area where actually Valve's coaching rule change, so the in-game leader, the coach can't be the in-game leader fully in the game, is actually a benefit. Because I'll tell you what, with a person like God B, this is a great example. Because if it still existed where you could be the coach and in-game lead the whole game, then a bunch of teams could do exactly this without even risking as much, because they could still have their real in-game leader, and they could set, usually the in-game leader is the weaker player, and they could bring in a big fragger who's like a young talent or a guy who's just a free agent and have him play in his spot, then qualify through a minor or something like that, and then go elsewhere. I mean, you can already think of other teams that could do this basically and have a really good chance. I mean, that would actually allow some European teams who are good to potentially do this in certain rare cases, depending on what someone's passport is, or if they just happen to have 2 players from that region. Now, my issue is this. I actually think that the obvious way to fix this rule is, remember, we're looking at what is the spirit of the rule. The spirit of the rule is to protect the regional slots and make sure that it's actually a North American majority team that qualifies for the offline qualifier. So to get that spirit, I want to make it so that 99.999% of teams aren't fucked over by me changing a rule and putting a new place, but it closes this little loophole for the 1 or 2 teams that might exploit it. So here's what I would think you should have to do. If a team such as NRG, we'll use them as an example, uses a stand-in so that they can then be eligible to compete in the minor for that region, Americas, or European, ECIS, whatever the region is, if they then qualify for the offline qualifier, they should then have to use that player who was a stand-in as one of their players in the main offline qualifier. In fact, if they only had 3 players eligible for the qualifier, and it requires 3, you should have to maintain those 3 for the whole qualification process. So if you qualify for the offline qualifier, you have to keep that guy in, and if you then make it to the major, you have to keep that guy in, or you can replace him with another player from NA. But what you can't do is then go back to having a majority of the other region, because you should never have gotten that spot at the offline qualifier because you weren't regionally eligible, but you qualified when you were, and it's a little loophole you've exploited. Now, the beauty of doing this, so I'm essentially making a sort of legend spot, but a regional spot for the minor. Now, obviously, the reason I'm doing that is because it closes that loophole, but it doesn't actually affect anything for the majority of other teams. Like, for example, that's why I added in the little detail where, you have to replace them with another North American player. Because then, say a North American team who actually legit do just have 2 European players, and then they want to change your player, well, it can now change for any North American player for that third NA player that they're removing. Now, obviously, they can't bring in a European player and have 3 Europeans, but then again, they shouldn't be able to anyway. That would actually be an inadvertent way of abusing the same loophole that they hadn't planned to, but they would end up doing it the same way as it is. I mean, in the future, if you want another example of where this could be abused, this could also mean that teams who are real NA teams could qualify like that. And then this is an example of why Valve wouldn't want this, why this goes against the spirit of the rule. Let's say in the European minor, there's some really sick team. Like in the past, you could have had like Simple's worst players, could have been in the CIS one, and they might not even qualify through there. And then Simple says to some team who finished second in the Americas minor, you know what, kick out one of your NA players, let me play for this one major qualifier. You know what, just pay me good money, I'll play by myself, go ham. Obviously, Simple's the best player in the world. Was a godlike player anyway a few months ago when he was on in the summer when he was on shitty worst players. And so that would be some ridiculous scenario where you've not only abused the rule, but you now have a better chance as a result of abusing the rule. We don't want that to exist. That's not the spirit of how this rule and how the system was supposed to work in terms of slots. Now, it's also not as big a deal because it's only one major cycle. It's the minor, it's the offline qualifier, it's the major. After that, you're free to do whatever you want, change whatever players you want. So within that time frame, I think you should have to adhere to these rules. This is another example for me of where Valve not only needs more direct communication with the community, but actually, in my opinion, needs a community commissioner guy who people go to, bring these things up in advance, he has a look at them, and then they figure out what they're going to do before the tournament begins, because you can only change rules before the tournament begins or after the tournament's finished playing. I mean, the other examples of this exact same qualification system that I've seen like bullshit is the Crims scenario, where he's just gone back last minute to Fnatic and given Fnatic a legend spot back, but then fucked over his teammates in Godsent, have to go to the minor now. The Glaive one, where he was never a full member of that team and yet got to sit on a legend spot the whole time while he was planning to spend his career in Heroic, and then cause they make a drastic move last minute as well to bring him back in, they retain their legend spot while being able to kick a player. These are examples of where people are abusing loopholes in otherwise pretty decent rules that I can see how they protect the sport, and they don't protect the org, but you know what I mean, protect the sport in a way that adds some integrity to the game that wouldn't exist if just anything willy-nilly was allowed to go. So I think this loophole has to be closed, and I think it's bullshit.